Beneath the weight of immeasurable ages, before empires burned across the stars, and before the Republic's banners were ever raised, the tale begins upon a world of parched valleys and dust-choked skies. This world bore the name Korriban, its stark mountains and barren sands concealing within them burial chambers that stretched downward as if to anchor the memory of an entire people beneath stone. The beings who walked its surface were the Sith, crimson-skinned and fierce, their society woven of priest-kings, warrior lords, and keepers of rituals that mingled blood and the unseen currents of the Force. Their culture was at once tribal and imperial, for they revered hierarchies descending from shadowed monarchs whose line was said to have been touched by ancient gods. Among them rose traditions steeped in sacrifice, in communion with the unseen darkness they simply accepted as the truest shape of existence. Their temples seethed with fires that burned for centuries unbroken, while their tombs were passages into eternity, where servants and beasts alike were sealed beside their masters to guard them in death. Knowledge was bound into stone tablets and crystalline vessels, hidden in labyrinths that would defy the uninitiated. These Sith were not yet the Sith Lords whispered of in later millennia. They were a people unchallenged upon their homeworld, bound together by belief, ritual, and the harshness of environment, their destinies still glimmering only faintly at the horizon of time. The path of their future shifted with the arrival of others. Across the stars, a different order had already risen. The Jedi, who had schooled themselves in wielding the Force not with ritual and dominion, but with restraint and balance. And within that order, dissensions festered. There were those who believed the Force was not meant for calm service, but for conquest, for the bending of wills, for the mastery of life and death. These were the exiles who would one day carve the identity of the Sith into galactic memory. The division was brutal, remembered in shifting fragments, called by some the 100-Year Darkness. The war they waged against the Jedi ended in ruin, their armies shattered, their champions cast out from the Republic, cast beyond the familiar routes of known space. With nowhere to return and no mercy waiting, they fled into the depths. It was in the uncharted dark that their fate curved toward Korriban, for chance or destiny drew their vessels to that barren and ancient world. The Sith people beheld these pallid strangers, wielders of violent power. To the warriors and priests of Korriban, the exiled Dark Jedi appeared as gods made flesh, beings who could scorch armies with lightning or twist the air with a gesture. What had been scattered tribes beneath priest kings became suddenly subject to domination. The Dark Jedi, no longer held by oath or code, enthralled the Sith, binding themselves with the ruling bloodlines, mingling their lineage, teaching their way of the Force not as worship, but as weapon. From this union, of Force traditions ancient and exiled, of crimson flesh and pale visionary, arose a new dominion. The exiles proclaimed themselves lords of the Sith, for the very name of the species became indistinguishable from the title of those who ruled them. In this imperceptibly slow alchemy, the Sith as history remembers them emerged. Neither only the people of Korriban, nor only the bitter fugitives of Jedi wars, but something more enduring, forged in conquest, ambition, and secrecy. Temples once carved as monuments to memory expanded into necropolises that swallowed entire valleys, their walls coated with scripts burning with invocations of eternity and strength. Sidious, a colder world to the north of their domain, rose in prominence as their political capital, while Korriban remained the sacred seat of death, where only the most revered would be honored with timeless stone. The Sith Lords stretched their influence into bloodlines, ensuring their lineage bound both the conquering outcasts and the native rulers into one crimson-tinted dominion. It was through this mingling that the Sith began a culture of rule that was both mystical and merciless. Knowledge became possession, power jealously guarded. Apprentices lived with the silent certainty that survival meant betrayal, that continuity was never granted but always seized. The flickering torches along stone corridors whispered the same truth, that the dark was eternal and that eternity belonged to the strong. Their dominion remained hidden from the Republic for centuries. From the perspective of the wider galaxy, the Sith were forgotten, vanished into the folds of history after the turmoil of their exile. Yet upon their worlds, power grew like roots burrowed deep and unseen. Each tomb carved in stone was not merely a grave, but a declaration that the future still curved in their direction. Their kings adorned themselves with talismans able to warp the currents of life itself, and their sorcerers studied the stars, waiting for a moment to rise from silence into immensity. The archives left behind from those long centuries are broken and conflicting, carved in bones, concealed in holocrons, scattered across crypts. Some tell of whole dynasties who ruled for 1,000 years beneath the title Dark Lord. Others speak of reigns so brief they are remembered only by a single mark carved into stone. Yet the pattern remains unmistakable: ambition, challenge, victory, downfall, and renewal. For the Sith, to endure was to pass through cycles of fracture and reunion, with the knowledge that even in death, memory and presence could linger to whisper guidance or command. Thus the Sith were no longer merely a people of a distant world, nor only refugees of defeat. They became an order shaped in the cracks between histories, of blood and exile, of inheritance and will. A rhythm began in which power slumbered, then woke, then hunted its way forward. They existed now as both a species and a creed, their future already stretching far ahead, unknowable yet inevitable. As centuries settled into centuries, and tribes into dynasties, the patience of the Sith became their armor. They watched from the silence of their tomb worlds, from the crypt-lit archives of Sidious, as the Republic thrived in ignorance of what seeds had been sown so far beyond its borders. The Sith were waiting, still sketching dominion into the sand, still raising monuments to their own permanence, still whispering a creed that no galaxy yet heard. In time, their hidden dominion would speak through war. But in this first age, they were the silence before the storm, the shadow before recognition. And so the record begins here, in the intersection of exile and blood, on Korriban's dust and Sidious stone, where power silently tethered itself to legacy, and the word Sith no longer meant only a people of crimson flesh, but the embodiment of dominion, of secrets kept, of a path descending into shadows so deep they seemed endless. When time shifted forward, and the dynasties of Korriban had built their necropolises higher than the dunes and deeper than the bedrock could bear, the silence that had cocooned the Sith began to unravel. Their dominion, though cloaked far beyond the reach of Republic scouts, was never bound solely to isolation. For power does not find rest in closure, and the Sith lords of the late empires gazed ceaselessly toward the stars, threading their conquests into neighboring systems, bending colonies into obedience, and filling their records with trusting certainty that what was hidden would soon be made manifest across the galaxy once more. The patience of centuries became the restlessness of ambition. Empires do not dream idly forever. It was upon the passageways of hyperspace, still ill-charted at that ancient time, that the threads of destiny knotted. Republic explorers, dependent on chance and navigational gamble, one day stumbled upon the forbidden neglect of secrecy. The capped silence was torn open not by Sith intention, but by the arrival of foreign eyes. The rediscovery of the Sith Empire was not the call of deliberate diplomacy, but the jolt of collision between a sheltered dominion grown strong and quiet, and an expansive republic convinced of its own supremacy. Legends remember that the first meeting came as accident. The Dargon siblings, explorers from the core worlds, finding in their desperate flight from intrigue a route into a storm-swallowed corridor of space that opened suddenly before them upon the hidden Sith Empire. Their arrival was considered violation, intrusion into the sanctity preserved for a millennium, and they were dragged before throne and judgment. The Empire in that age rested in the hands of dark lords whose pride was fortified by generations of rule, and debates began within their chambers about whether to destroy or exploit the arrival of outsiders. Among the Sith High Council stood Naga Sadow, whose ambition was not content with containment. To him, this intrusion signaled more than chance. It became the opportunity the ancestors had whispered toward, the long-awaited vessel that might bear their dominion into the wider galaxy. Contrasted against the cautious counselors who doubted their readiness, Sadow gathered shadows about himself. He created deceptions of attack upon the Sith from Republic infiltrators, staging assaults that drew fear and drove his rivals into silence. In the smoke of treachery, He rose from his peerage to the title of Dark Lord, carrying an empire upon his name. The Great Hyperspace War, as it came to be whispered, was less a sudden spark than an inevitable surge. With fleets conjured from star forges, vessels powered by sorcery and disbelief, and rituals inscribed across banners of war, Sidious drove the Sith Empire against the Republic. It was the first time the Sith moved openly with armies, no longer phantoms of Korriban's tombs, but warlords pressing upon the core. Assaults flashed across Republic worlds, embers rising into flame, for the strategies of the Sith were devised of both cunning and the manipulation of fear. Armies were not only slain but made to doubt themselves, rumors planted, leaders swayed, and despair seated alongside fire. Yet war is never merely a matter of ambition. The Republic rallied, the Jedi awakened into guardianship, and where the Sith sought to crush, resistance swelled. The campaigns wove outward, stretching lines too thinly, pressing ships too far, scattering garrisons beyond cohesion. At Coruscant, the Sith push failed, stalling like a blade arrested inches from its mark. The Jedi Knights, guardians bound by their ancient codes, repelled the advance, wielding unity where the Sith exalted division. Sidious himself, both master strategist and betrayed manipulator, withdrew back into Sith space, convinced retreat could preserve empire until another day. But betrayal is written endlessly in Sith memory, and Sidious' rivals, never wholly suppressed, turned upon him. The Empire devoured itself as the Republic closed tighter around their star systems. At Korriban, the Grand Tomb World, Sidious' forces staggered and died. The fleets that had once darkened the skies cracked beneath Republic counterattacks. The empire that had waited centuries to emerge into the wider galaxy was thrust back into ruin in the span of a war so brief that centuries of hidden strength dissolved in a generation's time. The Great Hyperspace War, for the archives of both Sith and Jedi, marked devastation and dispersal. Some Sith worlds burned, some yielded, some sealed themselves in ritual silence never to emerge again. Those of the ruling class who survived watched their dominion collapse into fragments scattered across unknown reaches. The Republic believed it had extinguished the Sith as one sweeps away a house of ash after flame. For them, the story ended at triumph. The Sith were nothing now but a memory imported into Jedi chronicles as a warning of ambition's cost. Yet the Sith endure not merely in empire but in seed, in ember, in fragment clung to with desperation. Naga Sidious, escaping destruction, is said to have vanished into exile upon Yavin's jungled temples, carrying with him sorcery and apprentices, embedding his presence into places of stone and shadow. Other survivors, nameless fugitives, slipped between stars and dragged their lineage with them, passing on rituals and whispers, vowing revenge in secret. And beneath the sands of Korriban, the tombs still murmured, for the stone remembered what the galaxy forgot. In this way, the Great Hyperspace War was less an ending than a dispersal. The Sith as empire died, the Sith as memory endured, and in that endurance lay inevitability. The Republic turned its gaze elsewhere, content that peace had prevailed. The Jedi spoke of vigilance, but slept beneath their triumph. Yet in the crevices left behind, Sith spirit shifted further from nation into creed, no longer dependent on the strength of armies, but upon the patience of secrecy, awaiting the next age when ambition would once again reach outward from the darkness. Thus the archives recall the rise, the reach, and the swift disintegration, that moment when the Sith emerged grandly into the stars only to be crushed and scattered, leaving behind only fragments. Yet fragments, for the Sith, were never silence, for within each remnant lay a gathered shadow, invisible yet alive, ready to survive the collapse of empire and begin again. To outsiders, they had perished. To themselves, they had simply been forced back into the twilight that had always nourished them. The Great Hyperspace War, remembered in quiet temples of ruin, was the first cry of the Sith against the Republic, and the enduring lesson was not its failure, but survival. From that survival, new chapters gathered themselves in the folds of centuries still to come. In the long quiet that followed the collapse of the Great Hyperspace War, the galaxy settled into the illusion of peace. The Republic had turned its eyes inward, congratulating itself on survival and stability, even as the frontiers of its space remained raw, uncertain, and unguarded. The Jedi, though ever wary, allowed themselves the calm that comes after victory, teaching a new generation that the Sith menace had been extinguished. But in truth, nothing of the Sith was truly gone. If Empire had been broken, fragments remained. If armies were lost, secrets endured. What lingered was not the dominion of fleets and thrones, but the lingering persistence of a creed that had already proven itself immortal. Those fragments took many shapes. The greatest of Sith empires crumbled into splinters, their lords gone into exile, their worlds burned or abandoned. Yet among the survivors were those who buried themselves within the farthest stars, hiding as forgotten kings and patient whisperers. Naga Sadow, who had risen to Dark Lord only to bring ruin upon his empire, fled into the steaming jungles of Yavin 4, far from Republic paths. There he bent his strength not toward rebuilding empires of fleets and fortresses, but toward temples of crushing stone, carved into the very mountains so that the jungle itself would one day veil them. In his tombed sanctuaries, he bound his spirit, etching incantations deep into their foundations, ensuring that his apprentices and their apprentices after them would draw from his lingering presence when time returned opportunity to them. Long after his physical death, the stone of Yavin continued to resound with his will, carved in rituals passed into bloodlines of those who called themselves his heirs. Others, less fortunate or less ambitious, lived out smaller survivals. Some Sith cults wandered into obscurity among forgotten worlds, forming enclaves where their rituals persisted without greatness, where lineages of Sith sorcery survived habited in secrecy. These were shadows of shadows, fragmentary orders that carved their legacy not into empire, but into the private whispers of families and hidden disciples. They carried forward incantations, sacrifices, and half-faded fragments of Sith teachings, preserving them through centuries marked not by conquest, but by endurance. Among the crumbling remnants of what had once been a dominion, the common thread was secrecy, the understanding that to endure was not to remain visible, but to disappear long enough to gather strength. For the Sith, survival was itself power, and defeat was transmuted into a lesson that to rise again, ambition must first pass unseen, hidden beneath cover of time. Yet while the old masters carved enchantments into jungle stone and cults passed down rituals as ancestral secrets, deep within Korriban itself the planet refused to let go. The tombs that laced its valleys, carved with hieroglyphs of power and warded with deadly guardians, remained repositories of ancient authority. Precautions passed by ancient sorcerer lords still burned upon those chamber walls, and within their coffins of obsidian, the remains of giants of earlier ages murmured faintly into eternity. Spirits lingered, half present in the currents of the Force, neither entirely faded nor fully alive. They whispered wisdom, promises, and seductions, waiting for new seekers to fall into their presence. With the Sith scattered among cults, tombs, and hidden legacies, a question always remained as to whether another figure might pull fragments together, molding them into new unity. For the Jedi, the Sith seemed destroyed, and thus inattention returned. But in the chronicles of Sith heritage, this age of obscurity sowed the seeds of the next awakening. Lineages of ritual spoke of destiny unborn, tombs whispered of futures still to be claimed, and generations who grew under secrecy were nurtured into a hunger for resurgence. The collapse of empires left scars not merely upon the galaxy, but upon Sith memory itself. From Naga Sadow's exiled presence forward, the tales become murkier. Even the Sith legends contradict one another. Some claim that entire dynasties rose again on Korriban before dying into silence. Others insist that scattered cults were all that remained until much later centuries. But this ambiguity itself shaped their mythology, for it ensured that any heir, any warlord, any seeker who stumbled upon a fragment of Sith teaching could name themselves legitimate continuation. To inherit the shadow was itself permission to shape the future. And so the fractured age settled across centuries, an interlude of quiet yet teeming survivals. Republic historians recorded no great Sith armies, which to them meant the menace had ended. Jedi archives held little beyond warnings not to tread among certain ruins, and their younger generations came to think of Sith not as rival powers, but as old myth. But the Sith themselves, quietly and in pieces, knew they awaited. They were gnawing roots beneath galactic stone, patient, undying, cloaked in shadows until the day inevitability once more drew them to the surface. As ages turned, fragments avoided disintegration, binding themselves discreetly to forests, tombs, temples, lineages, even to forgotten bloodlines slipped anonymously among subject peoples. Their presence lay coiled, often invisible but always lingering. They were the broken pieces of yesterday, still sharp, still cutting quietly, waiting to be assembled together by hands ambitious enough to place them. Thus, the legacy of the Great Hyperspace War did not end in disappearance, but in scattering. The Sith as armies fell into dust. The Sith as creed became incorporeal, yet multiplied, lingering like a low tide beneath a galaxy high with its own self-confidence. The scattered age preserved all that would come after, for within its shadows, Sith memory carried forward the inevitability of renewal. And from these remnants, in time, another chapter of awakening began, a legend of resurgence that would once again shake the galaxy and restore the name of the Sith not as rumor, but as terrible presence. From the scattered fragments of memory and ruin, the Sith legacy began its slow and secret turning toward rebirth. Time had stretched on, long enough for centuries of Jedi to grow complacent, long enough for the Republic to unlearn the taste of true peril, long enough for the wounds of the Great Hyperspace War to fade into the faintness of rumor and story. Yet where empires may wither in the light of history, the Sith endured in the hollows of obscurity, their tradition of secrecy sharpening into a weapon more patient than open conquest had ever been. In that silence, there arose one of the most potent and remembered awakenings of their creed, the age of Exar Kuin and Ulic Qel-Droma, when Sith power surged once more from memory into flame. The groundwork for this resurgence began not upon Korriban, nor Zayast, nor even within the buried crypts of Yavin 4, but through the restlessness of seekers among the Jedi themselves. Throughout the history of the Jedi Order, there had always existed a current of dissatisfaction, a temptation toward what lay forbidden. Some questioned the limitations demanded by their oaths, the disavowal of attachment, the restriction of ambition. Others found themselves ensnared by the allure of knowledge deemed too dangerous. Across centuries, this current rarely triumphed, for the structure of the Order disciplined it back into balance. Yet it never disappeared, and in that muttering undercurrent the shadows of the Sith found an anchor. Exar Kuin was such a seeker, a Jedi of promise, brilliant and certain, drawn by the gleam of knowledge wherever it might hide. To him, curiosity was not a sin, but the very breath of mastery. He resented walls placed before understanding, and when his questions fell upon the ancient Sith, deemed by the Jedi to be relics not to be pursued, his interest deepened into an obsession. Against the wisdom of his teachers, he quested into the depths of forbidden archives, following rumor and shard until his path led inevitably toward the tomb worlds themselves. His journey carried him to Korriban, where the Valley of the Dark Lords whispered across its stones as if the dead themselves exhaled in his presence. There he touched upon memories preserved for generations, the spirit of Freedon Nad, Sith sorcerer and heir to Naga Sado's shadowed teachings. It was Nad who coaxed Exar Kuin further into the depths of temptation, leading him away from the Jedi entirely, drawing his ambition along the ancient road the Sith had always offered, the road where knowledge was not restricted but devoured, where strength could expand without horizon, where mastery meant dominion. Kuin followed willingly, abandoning robes of the Jedi for the trappings of Sith sorcery. His path took him further, into the jungles of Yavin 4, where the temples still whispered with the lingering will of Naga Sado. There, in the darkness of ritual chambers carved beneath jungle stone, Kuin completed his transformation. He obeyed the voices of the tombs, submitting himself to ancient trials, until the power of relic and incantation bound him to the legacy of Sith Lords past. Yet Exar Kuin was not to stand alone, for the Sith creed rarely spreads without entangling others. His charisma, sharpened by dark power, drew apprentices and adherents to him. The most notable of these entanglements was Ulic Qel-Droma, a Jedi Knight of courage and conviction, tempted not purely by ambition but by circumstance and tragedy. In campaigns upon the world of Onderon, he stepped onto the path of the dark side, prey both to his own certainty and to Sith spirits who had lingered from the line of Freedon Nad. It was there that his fate intertwined with Kuin's. For Kuin, ever the opportunist, recognized in Ulic both rival and ally, and together they forged a partnership, unstable, inevitable, and devastating to the galaxy. The two rose as standard-bearers of a Sith resurgence. Exar Kuin proclaimed himself Dark Lord of the Sith, a title woven from the echoes of ages past, a mantle stolen from tombs and raised again into the light. Ulic, though never entirely free of conflict within himself, stood at his side, binding fleets and armies beneath their cause. Their movement spread quickly, for the Republic had grown unprepared. Jedi defectors, seduced by Kuin's eloquence and the promise of freedom without restraint, bent to his cause. Armies of Mandalorians and disaffected warriors were enticed into rebellion. Sith amulets and artifacts carved from older ages added dreadful strength to their gathering legions. The war that followed uncoiled like a serpent across the galaxy. Known as the Great Sith War or the Exar Kuin War, it was the first true resurgence of the Sith since the Hyperspace War, and it bore similarities. Fleets ravaged planetary systems, temples burned, Jedi fell. Battles stretched across the core and into the outer rim. The balance of the Republic trembled. Worlds that remembered nothing of the Sith except half-forgotten rumor now saw their banners spread across the skies. The Jedi, who had told themselves that Sith were only ancient myth, found the myth suddenly given flesh. Yet even within power, Sith fate repeated its own patterns. For Kuin and Keldroma, though allies, never achieved harmony. Ambition collides with ambition, and distrust is seated deeply in the creed of domination. Kuin sought to establish a dominion where relic and sorcery gave him preeminence, while Keldroma struggled with his deeper identity, torn strenuously between the shadows he had embraced and the light he could not fully renounce. The war they forged together unmade itself as swiftly as it was created. The Jedi rallied with unity the Sith lacked. At the climactic end of the war, Keldroma, broken by loss and betrayal, renounced his path, surrendering himself and betraying Kuin's designs. Kuin, desperate and defiant, withdrew finally into the temples of Yavin, the very sanctuaries where Sidious had lingered before him. Surrounded, he poured his essence into the very walls with ancient rituals, binding himself into stone as Naga Sidious had done, ensuring his spirit endured though his empire fell. Yavin's jungles swallowed another lord into their haunted silence. The Great Sith War dissolved as the Hyperspace War had before it. Empires of ambition obliterated, leaders cast down, fleeting flames extinguished. For a second time, the Republic declared itself cleansed of Sith threat, and the Jedi taught new generations that vigilance had triumphed. But the Sith knew a different truth. For with each apparent ruin, their creed endured through remnant and survivor, through hidden lore and confined spirits, through whispers buried in stone. In the legacy of Exar Kuin and Ulic Keldroma, the Sith possessed proof that even after centuries of seeming silence, resurgence remained inevitable. Each collapse planted new seeds. Each ruin left embers glowing still. The continuity was not in empires that lasted, but in memory that could never be extinguished. Sith history, remembered as one endless current of decline and resurgence, taught its faithful that no defeat remained permanent. From slaves to exile, from empire to collapse, from silence to terrible awakening, the Sith creed endured because it outlasted every form it had once held. Thus the rise of Exar Kuin and the war that bore his name served as both proof and warning that the Sith, even in fragments, could awaken across centuries to burn once more against the Republic. And though Kuin's body dissolved into dust and Keldroma passed into haunted repentance, their shadow lingered, watching, waiting, whispering of a resurgence yet to come. When the embers of Exar Kuin's war had faded into ash and silence, the galaxy once more told itself that peace had returned. Republic officials spoke of resilience. Jedi masters wrote in their archives of vigilance restored, and new generations of ordinary citizens lived their lives unaware of what specters had slipped between their stars. Yet as always, it is in the quiet after storms that seeds of shadow most deeply root. The Sith Creed, dismembered yet never destroyed, survived in fragments, talismans, spirits, and most of all in the restless ambitions of individuals for whom memory was a door that might once more be opened. Out of this fracture grew the path toward the conflict known in layered memory as the Jedi Civil War, a war that unfolded less as a clash of foreign empire and republic, but more as a convulsion born within the very heart of the Republic itself. Where the Great Hyperspace War and the Great Sith War had been battles waged by armies from the outside, the Jedi Civil War was war from within, a struggle that revealed just how deeply Sith influence had grafted itself into the marrow of the Jedi Order, even when thought long extinguished. The Sith in this era did not emerge from Korriban's tombs nor Zayast's councils, but from the ranks of the Order sworn to extinguish them. To understand the Sith resurgence in this age, one must remember that unrest had never ceased. In the years following the Great Sith War's conclusion, the Republic entered an age of fatigue and slow decline. The Jedi, stretched across the stars, accepted the burden of guardianship over a Republic weakened by its own expansion and corruption. When the Mandalorian tribes, resurgent and united under warrior command, began driving conquest across the Outer Rim, many within the Republic begged for Jedi intervention. Yet the Order, steeped in caution after its ordeal with Exar Kun, hesitated. It was in this hesitation that destiny formed. Among the Jedi stood Revan, brilliant, inquisitive, and determined, echoing the very restlessness that centuries earlier had carried Exar Kun upon his path. Revan did not accept stillness as wisdom. He believed that to act was itself duty. When the Order stalled against the Mandalorian threat, Revan and his closest ally Malak defied the Council, rallying younger Jedi and leading fleets into the fire of war. In those campaigns, Revan proved himself both masterful tactician and unbending will. Victory after victory was claimed not only by strategy, but also by his magnetism, his power, his unshakable belief that his actions were both justified and necessary. The Mandalorians, who had threatened collapse of the Republic, were broken at last by Revan's campaign, cast down in fire. But as always, the question lies not in victory, but in what it costs. In the farthest reaches where the Mandalorian conflict drew him, Revan stumbled into places where Sith memory had lingered, remnants of the infinite empire, fragments of Sith power hidden beyond the edge of Republic awareness. There, Revan's destiny shifted. Some accounts say ancient Sith empires, surviving still in exile, captured and remade him. Others whisper of hidden worlds where he uncovered artifacts of overwhelming darkness. Still others remember only that he returned different, not as Jedi champion, but as Sith Lord. In Malak, he found apprentice and enforcer, and together they emerged into the galaxy not in the name of the Republic, but in the name of domination. Their fleet rebuilt from the war machines of vanquished Mandalorians and secret forges uncovered in the unknown. Thus was born the Jedi Civil War, a title deceptively simple, for beneath it lay the revelation that Jedi could give birth to Sith, that guardianship could transmute itself into tyranny. When Revan returned, it was at the head of a fleet, and upon his proclamation, he claimed dominion as Dark Lord of the Sith, while Malak stood as Darth beneath him. The Republic, weakened and weary, staggered under the new war. The Jedi found themselves facing their own defections, their own doubts, their own chosen champion turned against them. The war was devastating. Sith fleets surged once more across the galaxy, not as a foreign invasion, but as a grafted civil war. Worlds were lost, Jedi slain, the Republic fractured. Yet the war bore within itself the flaws of its masters. Revan and Malak, though bound by bond of mastery and allegiance, also carried within them the seeds of mistrust. Malak envied Revan, resentful of the master's prominence. Revan lived as much in vision as in command, seeking through conquest not only empire, but answers to questions buried beneath the shadows of galactic history. This tension split into violence, and as Malak struck treachery against Revan, claiming the mantle of Dark Lord, the war itself bent again under the familiar weight of betrayal. When Malak rose as Dark Lord, the conflict hardened into brutality. His campaigns became less about vision and more about destruction, less about answering the galaxy and more about bending it until nothing remained but rubble beneath his banner. Yet even then, the flaws of Sith tradition bore their inevitable fruit. Revan, cast down but not destroyed, was captured by the Jedi. Stripped of memory, reshaped by fate, he was set once more upon the path of the light. In this paradox, the galaxy found reprieve. The very Sith Lord who had sought its domination became the weapon of their undoing, striking against Malak, reclaiming his destiny, and ending the war that his own rebellion had begun. The Jedi Civil War ended as the Hyperspace War and coins before it. In collapse and ruin, Sith dominion burned away in fire. Malak perished, the forges fell, the Republic staggered but endured. On the surface, the galaxy had once again rid itself of the Sith. The pattern was familiar, almost ritualistic: emergence, triumph, betrayal, self-destruction, ruin. Yet within this repetition, the Sith still endured. For even in loss, memory lingered. Artifacts locked in vaults still whispered. Exiles scattered into darkness carried Sith teachings further still. And in the archives of Korriban, the tombs lay unchanged, patient, awaiting new seekers who would once more hear their call. Thus the Jedi Civil War proved another lesson written into the slow chant of Sith history, that they did not require great empires to survive, but only the ambition of a single seeker. Every resurgence had burned hot and died swiftly, and yet each had extended the shadow further across history. Revan and Malak, though undone, ensured that the galaxy once more remembered the Sith not as myth, but as possibility, and that memory was enough to keep the shadow breathing for the centuries yet to come. The Jedi Civil War ended in fire and in silence, but as the centuries turned thereafter, the fate of the Sith followed the familiar rhythm of decline into shadow. With each rise, the Sith had torn themselves into fragments, seized upon power too quickly, or shattered under the weight of betrayal. And in each fall, the Republic and its wary guardians in the Jedi Order believed, or at least dared to hope, that the darkness had been extinguished. Yet history, bent into its slow cadence, carried the same lesson again and again, that where there was ambition, where there was hunger, where memory lingered in stone or holocron or whisper, the Sith endured. The decline that fell after Revan and Malak's ruination was not sudden, but it was deep. The scattered survivors of the Sith fleets, leaderless and hunted, frayed themselves into obscurity. Without their dark lords, without vision or purpose, many splintered into small war bands roaming the edges of known space, their ships degrading into piracy, their traditions lapsing into fragments remembered and spoiled over time. The Republic considered them no more threatening than bandits. The Jedi considered them as weeds cut low, without root to regrow. Yet history suggests some seeds found hard enough soil even in this thinning twilight. Upon the tombs of Korriban, channels of Sith learning continued waiting, undisturbed and undiminished, preserved by guardians more than mortal. Spirits tied to their sacred necropolis never allowed decay of memory, whispering still to any stray initiate with courage enough to kneel among the dust. Wanderers, mercenaries, and fallen Jedi who drifted toward the barren world often left transformed, carrying away shards of knowledge that to them became entire traditions. None rose to truly command empires in such a time, but the creed lived, carried subtly from master to apprentice as flame carried from torch to torch in a vast darkness. This was an age of shadows and cults, where the Sith rarely stood with armies or banners, but rather as conspiracies hidden in the hearts of civilizations. Sith disciples infiltrated through subtlety, not conquest, wearing faces of priests, philosophers, mercenary captains, or secret councils. They spoke no longer in proclamations of dominion, but in whispers of corruption, weaving themselves into the quiet folds of galactic life so well that even the Jedi, weary and restless after centuries of war, dismissed them as myth. Still, the resurgence of Sith influence was not absent. In this age, the great Sith Empire hidden beyond the edges of Republic space still endured. In secrecy and exile since the ruin of the Great Hyperspace War, this exiled empire rebuilt itself quietly among forgotten regions. It kept to the legacy of the ancient lords, guided by an unbroken lineage of rulers that claimed to stretch back to Naga Sadow and beyond. For centuries, this distant Sith empire grew in silence, cloaking itself from detection, honing its armies, growing its ambitions into something greater than the scattered cults within Republic borders. These dual survivals, the scattered cults clinging to old knowledge in the known galaxy and the hidden empire gathering patience in forgotten space, created a dichotomy that endured for generations. The Sith existed on two planes, as whispers and ruins haunting the Republic's own shadow, and as unseen strength consolidating far outside their borders. For the Jedi, the concern became one of endless vigilance, though stretched thin. They quelled whispers when they arose, confiscated artifacts, extinguished cults when they appeared, and taught their young initiates that the Sith returned always when ignored. Yet war after war ended, and as centuries passed without clear revelation of another Dark Lord wielding fleets, the danger seemed gradual, diminished, perhaps even finished. But Sith memory remembers decline not with fear, but with expectancy. For every pause, every silence, every century wherein their existence dimmed, their creed merely waited. Unlike other powers that demanded presence, the Sith understood endurance as strength. The rule of Sith throughout ages was not one of steady empire, but of cycle, to rise, to fall, to hide, to return. What the Republic saw as vanishing, the Sith knew only as gestation. Among certain Jedi scholars, even at the time, there existed recognition of this danger. They cautioned their fellows never to allow peace to become complacency, to remember that shadows always bent beneath their light. Yet as generations moved on, such cautions grew dull in the ears of younger guardians. They had wars enough with Mandalorians, with pirates, with political turmoil of their Republic wards. The Sith seemed less enemy than bedtime story, invoked as a warning to initiates against pride or ambition. The deeper truth was left to lie still upon Corbin's marble dust or sealed within relics of long-banished sorcerers. Forgotten by the galaxy, remembered by eternity. But in the bones of Sith history, the silence itself becomes its own story. The fate of Revan taught that the Jedi themselves might yet become the soil from which Sith could re-emerge. The ruin of Kuin reminded them that forbidden knowledge always waits for the hand bold enough to reopen it. And the fracture of Malak showed how swiftly Brotherhood descends into betrayal once bound to ambition. The Jedi did not forget those tales entirely, but neither did they prepare for their repetition. This period is remembered in Sith lore as the decline, when remnants drifted into shadows and nothing broader remained. But in that decline, apprentices were still taught. Holocrons still glimmered when called upon. Priests whispered liturgies beneath sealed chambers. Spirits suffused tomb halls and temples, waiting with their cold patience. And beyond even these, in the uncharted abyss of forgotten sectors, an entire Sith empire lived its centuries in concealment, knitting its power in ways the Republic could not even dream. That empire, unlike the cults, unlike the haunted tombs, unlike the wayward warbands, was never quite gone, only sharpening its dagger, only stewarding its silence until time itself would open the gate of its return. Thus the decline into obscurity was no death. It was a pause, a breath drawn in, the slow closing of eyes before slow reopening once more. Sith tradition never admitted extinction. Every fall became the next foundation. Every silence became a sharpening. And the galaxy, resting content with victory and blind to the patience of its sworn enemies, drifted unknowingly closer to the next surge of terrible awakening. The silence that followed the long centuries of obscurity was deceptive. To the Republic, the Sith were relics spoken of with reverence for their danger and dismissal for their absence. To the Jedi, they had become a moral tale, a necessary shadow cast to define the light, but not a living adversary pressing even distantly upon their halls. Yet to the Sith themselves, scattered and patient, concealed in necropolises or bound into hidden traditions, this was no extinction. It was the breath before a word, the calm before the return. And in the hidden reaches of space, far beyond Republic cartography, there remained an entire empire that had survived the purge of Naga Sadow's downfall. The true Sith Empire, restored and maintained in exile, ruled by lords whose line never fully broke. This exiled Sith empire endured in forgotten sectors for centuries, its presence unknown to a republic convinced that its danger had long been extinguished. They wandered through a slow age of concealment, spreading colonies across barren worlds, concealing fleets within uncharted nebulae, sustaining bloodlines of Sith rulers who styled themselves heirs to Sidious, to Ragnos, to every shadowed name carved deep into Corbin stone. By the perfection of their secrecy and the patience of their exile, they had accomplished what none of their more reckless forebears had achieved. They built endurance. To wait centuries and yet remain sharpened in ambition became their greatest power. When at last their return came, it was not sudden lightning flashing against a clear sky. It was a tide slowly unfurling after centuries of preparation. This era, which later recollections call the resurgent Sith Empire, revealed itself like the uncovering of something forgotten, and its return was all the more jarring because none had believed such a thing could exist. The Republic, fragile in its continuities, stunned itself in disbelief. A Sith dominion survived? Entire fleets in exile? Armies honed across centuries of silence? And yet there they were, pouring forth like a storm from darkened space, lanes long thought empty. The return of the Sith Empire drew the galaxy immediately into war. To citizens of the Republic, it was as though a specter had stepped out of legend with flesh again. Sith fleets hammered into known space, pressing along corridors of hyperspace, striking against outlying planets. The Republic wavered, and the Jedi, though guardians, found themselves staggered by revelations that decades of vigilance had somehow failed to prevent. This was not a cult risen around a single renegade. This was a civilization sharpened by centuries of anticipation, bent wholly upon conquest. This conflict became a slow war of decades, remembered as the Great Galactic War in some accounts, and to those who lived it, an era when the Sith presence was neither fleeting nor quickly consumed by its own division. For the first time since the earliest wars of dark and light, the Sith dominated as equal to the Republic. They pressed claims openly and sustained them, capturing worlds, subjugating systems, and enthroning their dominion outward into galactic memory once again. Among Sith lords of this era, records conflict as they always do. Some chronicles name leaders descended directly from the bloodlines of antiquity. Others point to a shadowy figure known as the Sith Emperor, an enduring presence whose lifespan outlasted centuries, perhaps even millennia, ruling as a figure of both political and mystical dominance. His hand guided fleets, his will bent civilizations, and his desire seemed boundless, not merely for galactic empire, but for the very consumption of life and spirit. To the Republic and the Jedi, he was myth recreating itself as reality, a godlike ruler from beyond forgotten centuries, leading a people long thought destroyed, but now fully alive and terrible again. The war was long, filled with endless campaigns across the core and the rim. Sith and Jedi locked themselves in seemingly endless confrontation. Republic armies, weakened and resilient all at once, bent beneath sieges, lost strongholds, and regained them again, worlds flickering between banners of loyalty to light and dark. Within occupied territories, Sith governance imposed its will with the combination of law and fear, re-establishing practices that tied directly back to the ancient Sith dominions on Corbin and Sidious. Temples were raised, sacrifices enacted, bloodlines exalted, and sorcery interwoven with political dominion. Unlike the brief flames of the Great Hyperspace War or Exar Kuin's reign, the resurgent Sith Empire showed itself to be lasting. Decades flared by in stalemate, battles fought and refought, peace attempted and fractured. The most infamous of these interludes came at the sacking of Coruscant, when Sith fleets struck the Republic capital itself, trampling into its heart at the very center of galactic life. The Jedi Temple burned. Monuments collapsed beneath fire. The Republic, humiliated, signed an uneasy peace in the wake of such devastation, ceding planets, renouncing claims, bending its pride. Never before since the earliest Sith ages had the galaxy seen such a terror. Jedi cast to the ground. Republic armies crumbled, the Sith re-establishing dominion as though centuries of exile had never passed. The uneasy peace lasted, but peace meant only opportunity to prepare for further conflict. The The Sith Empire, enthroning itself in rediscovered majesty, did not diminish. Their emperor, withdrawn into silence as often as he appeared, remained the unseen while behind their actions. In Republic sectors, the memory of Coruscant's sacking never faded. For a generation, young citizens were raised knowing that Sith were not fiction, not myth, not memory, but a power that stretched a dominion across half their sky and threatened to widen until nothing remained. This resurgent era's significance lay not merely in conquest, but in survival. The Sith had finally proven that they could exist not only as violent bursts, but as governments, authorities, and sustained powers, managing vast populations over many years. Even in eventual decline, for like all that came before, they would fade again. The proof was immortalized. The Sith were forever capable of return, no matter how absolute each prior ruin had seemed. Jedi chronicles, written after, struggle to trace this era cleanly, for contradictions abound between legend and fact. Was the emperor of this Sith line truly immortal, persisting for centuries as some spirit clinging to flesh through rituals? Or was he a succession of rulers claiming the same mantle to perpetuate illusion? The sources break, overlap, and confuse, as if even the telling of the tale is clouded by the very shroud of shadow that hid this empire so long. But whether mortal dynasty or immortal shade, the effect remained the same. Rule unbroken, ambition undimmed, an empire unextinguished through centuries. As with all Sith dominions, even this, seemingly so vast and terrible, began to dissolve across the arc of time. Intrigue eroded its unity. Ambition fractured its lords. Republic defiance and Jedi vigilance, after long decades of war, pressed once more into openings of weakness. Collapse followed slowly, but inevitably, as power shifted to new places and as betrayal reasserted itself as the silent heartbeat of Sith tradition. The resurgent empire weakened under weight of its own contradictions, and within new centuries it too fell into ruin. Yet a profound truth had already been carved into stone. The Sith could never be considered gone again. They were eternal, re-emerging across cycles of centuries, repercussive in their persistence. If their empire fell, they would not vanish. If their dominion fractured, it would live in cults and fragments. The galaxy could defeat them in battle after battle, generation after generation, yet the darkness never yielded, for in every pause, Sith legacy replenished itself, rediscovered by seeker, reawakened by artifact, reborn in ambition. The resurgent Sith Empire thus stands as one of the longest shadows of their history, sustained dominion proving beyond doubt that silence is not death, and that exile is not defeat. And from its ruin, the lessons learned folded back into the creed that never dies. To survive is to await, and to await is to rise again. The future still belonged to them, written invisibly already into the path of centuries still unwoven. The ruin of the resurgent Sith Empire did not arrive as a single crushing moment, nor as the fiery collapse that had marked the ends of Kuan, Sado, or Malak before it. Instead, it unfolded across slow centuries, like stone worn down under the steady patience of water. The Sith of this hidden dominion, so triumphant in their sudden eruption into the Republic's center, so assured of the permanence of their power, did not fall in brilliance, but in attrition. What had been unified became divided. What had been guided by an emperor's distant yet terrible will gave way to squabbling lords and self-devouring factions. Betrayal, the constant thread of Sith dominion, did not wait for enemies. It bloomed at home, pulling their empire into slow ruin as much as Jedi reprisal or Republic endurance. The Jedi, cautious yet vindicated with every year that their enemies weakened, pressed against Sith-held territories with patience equal to their foes' decay. Worlds once drowned in Sith banners were gradually reclaimed. Armies once so vast as to blot out the hyperlanes fractured into the private retinues of quarreling warlords, their purpose turning from conquest of the Republic to self-preservation. Within this slow unraveling, Sith culture itself began to bend once more toward what it had been in older declines. Not the Empire triumphant, but the cult, the fragment, the master and apprentice clutching what secrets they could salvage. Yet the memory of those centuries, when the Sith had once commanded half the galaxy's heart, could not fade. Even in retreat, in ruin, in vanishing, they held to the certainty that survival was always the seed of resurgence. Tombs endured. Holocrons preserved their voices. Spirits clung to stone hallways deep beneath Korriban's scarred cliffs. Beyond the outer rim, survivors carried lordship into anonymity, ruling over pockets of forgotten space as exiled monarchs who carried blood-stained traditions intact even while their fleets decayed. And in this interlude of disintegration, certain survivors still looked toward the future, convinced in their infinite patience that tides always returned. Some among Jedi lorekeepers refer to this age as the waning of the Sith. The Republic believed itself to have broken the enemy so completely that even their myths would eventually dissolve into irrelevance. Yet Sith histories remembered differently. The hidden records of lords and apprentices spoke of survival not as retreat, but as preparation. They told their initiates, their pupils, their future heirs, that decline itself was a kind of gestation, the chrysalis before rebirth. That what appeared broken was merely recombining itself in a new shape. To them, obscurity was not defeat but transformation. It was in this lingering shadow, with an empire bled down to secret lineages and whispers, that one figure emerged to carve perhaps the most influential change in Sith history since their first exile into Korriban's valleys. This figure, drawn not from the confusion of warlords, but rising from the deliberate study of Sith tradition and its endless cycles of self-destruction, was Darth Bane. He was not the founder of the Sith, nor their greatest emperor, nor even their most flamboyant warlord, but he was the one who raised from ruin the form that would carry the Sith into every future age thereafter. For from the disasters and constant failures of the Sith tradition, Bane assembled a single doctrine, that the many would fall into betrayal, but the few, or more precisely, two, might endure forever. Yet before Bane, there were fragments still burning. The aftermath of the resurgent empire left behind figures and conclaves, Sith spirits still enthroned in tombs, holocrons that whispered in hypnotic cadence to those daring enough to listen. Some warlords attempted resurgence and were dashed by Jedi intervention. Others turned inward, hoarding knowledge not for armies but for themselves. In this slow, shallow age, Sith power did not threaten the Republic with annihilation, but neither did it vanish. It drifted, fractured, casting shadows into the cracks of history, leaving behind only the lesson that the Sith always linger, waiting for the form in which they might endure past their own weaknesses. The Jedi, convinced at last of triumph, settled back into complacency, their energies bent more upon the landscapes of politics that dominated the Republic than the vigilance of older ages. With the Sith no longer rising with fleets and banners, the Order began to believe what it had always longed to believe, that darkness, though eternal, had been so diminished that it could no longer present true challenge. They taught about the Sith as one teaches about storms that marked the past, fierce and devastating, but never to be seen again. In doing so, they taught themselves to forget what shadow endures at the edges of every torchlight. This forgetting was precisely the silence from which Bane would build. He would gather what fragments still burned in holocron or temple, in decayed warlord or secret archive, and shape them into something lean, quiet, and enduring. Through him, the Sith would shed the ambition of crowds and instead turn to the careful endurance of secrecy, where failure would cease to matter because survival itself would always be certain. It was not his empire, but his doctrine, that carried the Sith forever onward. And thus, from the fragments of the resurgent empire's long collapse, something hardened into clarity. Centuries of betrayal and ruin, from Sidious to Kuin to Revan to Malak, resolved into recognition that sheer armies may win battles but cannot preserve the Sith. Only patience, secrecy, and inevitability could bear the weight of eternity. This was the soil into which Darth Bane planted his philosophy, the rule of two, which would guide every Sith thereafter and carve their shadow into the heart of the galaxy's greatest empires. But before Bane's doctrine, there was still decline, the slow vanishing of the mighty empire, the drift of Sith into fragment and rumor, the return once more into tomb-lit shadows and hidden whispers, another fall in the eternal rhythm, another step in the endless dance of concealment and return. The Sith had been an empire, and now they were fragments again, and yet they endured, because decline is never death, and collapse is always preparation. The galaxy believed the Sith undone. The Sith believed only that their moment to re-emerge again had not yet come. Among the ruins of the Sith's many failed dominions, where memory weighed heavier than armies and fragments outlived empires, an understanding finally took shape. For centuries, the Sith had risen in numbers, driven by councils, hierarchies, warlords, priest-kings, and ambitious dark lords surrounded by squabbling apprentices. And always, without exception, these multitudes had torn each other apart. For the Sith creed exalted passion, hunger, and ambition. Yet when gathered in legions, these very qualities corroded cohesion and undid dynasties from within. From Ajunta Pal's conquests to Naga Sado's deception, from Exar Kuan's betrayal-ridden war to Malak's envy and Revan's fall, every resurgence ended in the same climax. The Sith destroyed not only by Jedi opposition, but by their own insatiable rivalries. From this miasma of survivals and failures, a figure emerged whose vision altered Sith destiny as profoundly as any warlord before him. His name passed later into infamy, Darth Bane. Born not in corridors of power, but in hardship, his early life offered little hint of what legacy he would inscribe upon Sith history. Yet hardship itself became his forge. His rise coincided with the last convulsions of the Brotherhood of Darkness, one of the final large orders of Sith that sought once more to mimic the scale of armies, leading wars against the Jedi in the outer systems. The Brotherhood gathered thousands beneath their banner, and for a brief and terrible moment their war threatened to rise into another turning tide. Yet, as always, their numbers betrayed them. Ambition and jealousy unraveled them from within. The Jedi pressed advantage, and the Sith Brotherhood staggered, not defeated fully by enemies but corroded by themselves. It was amid this collapse, sifting through the wreckage of yet another failed expression of Sith ambition, that Bane framed his vision. He studied ancient accounts, drew from holocrons left to gather dust in tombs, listened to the faint whisper of spirits preserved in necropsian stillness. He recognized in their stories the endless repetition of failure, and he resolved to end that cycle. For him, the problem was not the hunger of the Sith. That hunger was their truth, their lifeblood. The problem was that hunger multiplied by many hands dissolved unity into chaos. The Sith were strongest not in thousands, but in a line so narrow as to be unbreakable. From this understanding, Darth Bane decreed what became known as the Rule of Two. From the ruin of warlord councils and sprawling armies, he gathered one revelation: that only two Sith must exist at any time. One master, to embody power and carry forward secrets. One apprentice, to embrace ambition and learn with that jealous hunger that would one day compel them to strike their master down and take their place. In such a cycle, knowledge would not dissipate into factions but condense into concentrated, distilled transmission from one to another, generation after generation. No councils to fracture, no armies to consume themselves. Only one bond, sharpened to inevitability, a master honing an apprentice strong enough eventually to destroy them. Thus continuity was paradoxically ensured through betrayal, and strength was continually refined, each generation rising from the death of the former. Bane's doctrine was not merely theory, it reshaped his every action. He cast aside remnants of the Brotherhood, slaughtering countless Sith who clung to the old ways of multitudes, ensuring that only his philosophy endured beyond him. He vanished into secrecy, for he understood that if the Sith were to endure, they could not flaunt themselves against the Republic as in centuries past. The Jedi, still hunting remnants of fractured Sith cults, believed they had finally purged the galaxy of darkness. In truth, what they had purged were weeds. What remained was a single, buried root, set deep by Bane, invisible on the surface, impossible to see until its growth surfaced centuries later. The Rule of Two became the defining rhythm of all later Sith history. It transformed the creed from a civilization of competing aspirants into a lineage of patience, secret, and inevitability. Holocrons preserved Bane's declarations, relics stored his presence, apprentices absorbed his teachings under pain of their own survival. And though the wider galaxy assumed the Sith had been extinguished, this continuity wound quietly through hidden decades, even centuries, master to apprentice, apprentice to master, each generation dying to give birth to the next. None built vast armies. None raised temples beneath the light of star lanes. None declared themselves openly to the Republic. Instead, they sharpened daggers in the dark, whispering that one day, through careful design, patient infiltration, long plotting, the galaxy itself would be theirs to seize. The Jedi and Republic, blind to this transformation, lived on convinced of their triumph. The Jedi restrained themselves to the role of guardians, thinking their greatest enemy defeated for all time. The Republic, weighed down by its endless cycles of politics and complacency, sank further into decadence, certain that no shadow waited to strike from beyond the stars. Yet beneath this complacency, the true Sith tradition built itself stronger than before, narrowed, hidden, purified into patience, no longer vulnerable to collapse of many hands, but instead bound to the rising line of two alone. Darth Bane himself, by some accounts, mastered rituals to extend his presence beyond natural life, lingering even after his body failed. Holocrons inscribed with his image advise apprentices centuries later, growling in dry tones the tenets he had carved into flame and steel. Whether spirit, echo, or artifact, he remained fixed in Sith history as a figure of permanence, not remembered for his own conquests, but for shaping the endurance of all Sith thereafter. Through his decree, obscurity became burial, and burial became preparation. No longer would the Sith erupt hastily into the galaxy, only to collapse again. Instead, they would bide centuries, invisible and patient, infecting the Republic from beneath rather than overwhelming it in sudden wars. It was the wisdom of failure reframed into inevitability. Bane had looked upon thousands of years of fragmentation and decline and drawn clarity. Secrecy was the shield of endurance, patience the truest weapon, and the hidden master-apprentice line the guarantee that the Sith would endure beyond every apparent extinction. Thus the rule of two sealed itself into the marrow of dark history. From Bane onward, through shadowed centuries, Sith history ceased to be the rise and fall of empires and became instead the invisible progress of a lineage. It was a current so deep it barely made ripples upon the galaxy above, until, after centuries of silence, its careful plan bore fruit. In that moment, far later, the Republic would learn that the Sith were not relics, not scattered ruins, but an enduring lineage waiting deliberately for the time when their patience would overturn the galaxy entire. For now, in the centuries after Bane, the Sith appeared extinguished, but in truth, their endurance had never been surer, their destiny never clearer. They had become silence given form, shaping themselves into a blade honed by time itself. The passage into the age that followed Bane's decree was marked less by the spectacle of war than by the peculiar persistence of silence. Where once fleets had thundered across the lanes of hyperspace and monuments had flared on every world that bent to Sith domination, now there lay quiet roads, unseen conspiracies, and the measured heartbeat of a lineage buried so deeply within time that even the galaxy forgot to look for it. This was not the silence of extinction, though to the Republic and Jedi alike it seemed as such. Rather, it was the cultivated stillness of a predator that knows the virtue of patience. The rule of two, born from Bane's vision, unraveled the very form of Sith history and reshaped it into something starkly resilient. For where multitudes had doomed the Sith in every age prior, a lineage of master and apprentice, only those two, no more, promised an endurance capable of escaping the endless cycle of self-devouring. Betrayal still lived at its heart, yet betrayal was no longer weakness. It was refined into system. Master passed knowledge to apprentice, who in turn grew in ambition, until the natural rhythm of power ended in succession through murder or domination. Such destruction no longer fractured empires. Instead, it ensured that power would condense further, each line culminating in a Sith stronger than the one before. The centuries of this hidden tradition remain some of the most obscure in Sith lore. Names surface from shadows as jagged reflections, sometimes no more than a rumor caught in a holocron's failing crystal, sometimes echoes accusingly whispered by the spirits who haunt Korriban's tombs. Few Jedi of those eras ever glimpsed them, fewer still survive to record their encounters. And yet the line continued unbroken. Hidden masters training apprentices, apprentices striking down masters, taking power, carrying teachings into the future. This new covenant shaped itself around secrecy not as a burden, but as guiding principle. Sith ceased their grand declarations. They no longer rallied war fleets or emblazoned banners on conquered worlds. Instead, they infiltrated. They studied the Republic not as enemy to be met in pitched battle, but as structure to be unraveled from the inside. Centuries of watching taught them its frailties, the greed of its politicians, the fragility of its bureaucracy, the corruption that spread wherever power lay too long unmonitored. Unlike ancient Sith who sought to crush the Republic by sheer force, the hidden lineage sought to make it collapse upon itself with their hand unseen. It is within this age that whispers abound of Sith lords who bent powers behind curtains, lending influence in senates or manipulating trade guilds, siphoning wealth and influence not to declare themselves, but to prepare for the harvest of a future plan. They studied corruption as carefully as their ancestors had studied sorcery, understanding that the next true domination would not be by fire, but by subversion. Rituals endured, the dark communion of spirits endured, but overlain with it came a new devotion to infiltration. In this blend of sorcery and politics, secrecy and betrayal, the Sith transformed into something unseen yet impossibly durable. What is remarkable in this period is not how much destruction the Sith dealt openly, but how thoroughly they resisted obliteration. By surviving in silence, they transcended defeat. The Republic could claim triumph again and again. The Jedi could tell new acolytes that Sith were gone forever, but neither were correct. The Sith no longer attempted the hubris of empire in the open. Instead, their power was distilled into a single line of inheritance, invisible yet inevitable, moving century by century like a tremor beneath stone foundations. This obscured era also deepened Sith philosophy itself. Where once they had exalted armies and bloodlines, now they exalted patience, cunning, and longevity. Masters schooled apprentices not only in the manipulation of the Force and the harnessing of passion, but in deception, restraint, and subterfuge. The dark side was no longer only a weapon of destruction. It was a veil of mystery, a cloak beneath which careful conspiracies could grow like moss in the cracks of monuments thought everlasting. The Jedi, meanwhile, drifted further into their own contentment. With each century that saw no renewed Sith wars, confidence hardened into doctrine. Sith, to them, became myth older than any living Jedi could remember. They dutifully taught about their enemies' passion, ambition, and fall into ruin, but in teaching them as distant history, they robbed them of immediacy. The Jedi learned to battle illusions of the past rather than hidden dangers of the present. With Sith passage narrowed now into only 2 at a time, the Jedi found nothing tangible to confront, and so they concluded triumph was complete. This blindness was itself the Sith's weapon, refined and sharpened by every passing generation. The Sith persisted like this for centuries, a vein of shadow threading quietly through the body of the galaxy. Master passed lessons to apprentice, apprentice surpassed master. Some of these Sith were forgotten even by haunted archives, yet their existence was enough, for the chain remained unbroken. And while their names dissolve into the mist of history, their work culminated in possibility, to one day rise at precisely the moment when enemy vigilance was weakest, when their hidden networks of control had anchored deeply enough, when their accumulated ambition could pivot the galaxy itself into their dominion. In this long age of obscurity, the Sith perfected endurance. They ceased to grasp at conquest that would be lost within decades. Instead, they sought conquest that would be absolute, thoroughly secured before the galaxy even knew the blow had been struck. Their silence became weapon, their invisibility became strength. No archives broke this chain because none witnessed it. Only faint scars upon politics and sudden silences in the Force betray their survival. Yet survive they did, one hidden master, one hidden apprentice, threading their way forward. And this endurance would one day deliver the culmination of Sith ambition, the grand plan, born in the contemplation of centuries, perfected in secrecy. The plan that would bring the Republic not to defeat in battle, but to collapse from within, to be ruled not for a moment, but for generations. That legacy, prepared in the shadows of this long silence, would give rise to the most infamous name in Sith history, a name spoken not first in fire, but in whispers within the dark corridors of power: Sidious. But Sidious lay centuries still away. For now, Sith history walked its slow hidden road, numbering its masters and apprentices, continuing its careful pattern of one and only one, biding the patience that would ensure the galaxy one day would awaken not to a battle, but to their dominion already achieved. This was the slowest, most enduring current of Sith history, a silence longer than any war, and in it the Sith gave themselves fully to patience, knowing that patience would crown them at last. From the shrouded centuries of quiet endurance and secrecy, the Sith lineage hardened itself into something altogether unrecognizable compared to the sprawling empires or flamboyant warlords of antiquity. They became scholars of patience, architects of transition, artisans of manipulation. Each master shaped one apprentice, and each apprentice eventually slew or surpassed the master, carrying the thread of knowledge further forward through the unobserved ages of the Republic. If the galaxy had glanced back at them through the smog of history, it would have seen nothing but silence, shadows, and absence. The Jedi saw victory. The Sith, in their hidden sanctuaries, saw inevitability approaching. And yet, even in such concealment, there came moments when the Sith brushed once more against the fabric of the galaxy. With each passing century, the hidden line grew cleverer in their approach, probing weaknesses, sometimes through subtle nudges that caused minor conflicts among Republic houses, sometimes by orchestrating trade collapses or exploiting instability across border systems. These ploys were faint and never claimed, for to reveal their hand would be premature. But behind them lay the same unfolding idea, that the galaxy might be unmade not by fleets or sorcery unleashed sacrificially on a battlefield, but through the slow corruption of its most vital foundations. The Jedi during this period drifted into their own paradox. They grew in prominence as guardians and political advisors, adored within the Republic at large as spiritual exemplars, their prestige heightened with every century that seemed unmarred by Sith resurgence. Yet that very prominence seeded their decline, for as their temples filled and their voices embedded themselves deeper into the legislative chambers of the Republic, they became less an order of vigilance and more an institution entwined with bureaucracy. They watched the Senate ever more closely, but their gaze fell upon maneuverings of law and procedure rather than ancient whispers lurking in tombs. In their victory, their imagination narrowed. They no longer expected the form of their enemy to evolve, and thus they missed the fact that the Sith were evolving faster than they. While Jedi taught new initiates to resist temptation and passion, Sith of this hidden lineage taught apprentices patience as virtue and preparation as salvation. Where Jedi studied detachment, Sith studied control. The Jedi cataloged Sith artifacts and placed them under lock within ancient vaults, believing that to secure relics was to secure history itself. Meanwhile, Sith apprentices were trained in the shadows to retrieve such relics, to plunder what was necessary for sustaining their inheritance. This secret hunt persisted quietly, stretching across centuries, where Sith in disguise walked the halls of Republic academies, posing as scholars, collectors, or obscure nobles, leaving with the knowledge preserved in holocrons and tomes. What the Jedi assumed protected was, in truth, infiltrated. Through this stealthy progress, the Sith began cultivating the ultimate idea that would define this long era. Not the gathering of armies, not the conquering of planets, but the corruption of civilization at its very heart. They envisioned the Republic not destroyed from without, but devoured from within by its own weakness, stirred and guided by Sith design. In their doctrine, politics became weapon, finance became instrument, war became a lever carefully pressed only when harvest was ripe. Though they still revered old rituals of the dark and still studied sorcery preserved in tombs, their true power shifted to mastery of intrigue. Legends of this lengthy twilight whisper that Darth Tenebrous, Darth Plagueis, and others of the Hidden Line refined this project into grand design, each built upon the labor of their predecessors, each widening the scope of Sith influence, threading their way into mercantile guilds, aristocratic corridors, and eventually even the Senate itself. These lords did not brandish swords upon battlefields, but wielded subtlety, poisoning dynasties, shaping treaties, breaking rivals slowly until collapse appeared natural, ordained, inevitable. By the time their successors would finally unveil themselves openly, the galaxy had been so softened, so carefully destabilized, that resistance would not even recognize itself as destroyed until it was far too late. Meanwhile, within the hidden line, the old Sith truths of death and inheritance grew ever sharper. Apprentice watched their master for weakness. Master ensured apprentice grew stronger, but never too quickly for immediate betrayal. Knowledge transformed from a flood of counsels into a distilled trickle, but one weighted with immense potency. It was said that what one apprentice learned across an entire lifetime could represent the refinement of thousands of years of Sith history, so carefully thinned into only the strongest elements. The chain, though narrow, grew unimaginably dense. To the galaxy, such centuries meant peace. To the Jedi, such centuries meant triumph. To the Sith, such centuries meant preparation for culmination. The currents of politics, economics, and military tension drifted onward without anyone knowing they were arranged by careful hands. The rule of two meant total invisibility, but invisibility fed inevitability, because no Jedi could see what no longer shouted in the open. And if the Republic no longer remembered malice of the Sith, then when malice finally declared its hand, the Republic would be helpless. As Republic complacency deepened, and as Jedi blurred themselves further with politics they had once sworn to stand apart from, the hidden Sith grew stronger. Their lineage, uninterrupted by the mistakes of councils, survived collapse after collapse merely by staying hidden. Even when names were forgotten, even when centuries of silence passed without confrontation, the Sith were carrying forward the same concentrated thread. For secrecy was no longer a weakness to them. It was their truest dominion, their final perfection. From this long shadow rose the minds that conceived the grand plan. It was whispered as inevitability, that the Sith would not merely return as conquerors for a generation, but would so thoroughly corrupt the Republic that its own citizens would accept Sith rule without knowing when the transition had begun. The Jedi, blind to such subtlety, would find their guardianship reduced to hollow symbols, and centuries of patience would result in triumph beyond anything the erratic empires of old could imagine. Thus the galaxy walked unknowingly on borrowed time. The hidden Sith manipulated in increments, their work laid across generations, but always building towards something no Republic citizen, no Jedi guardian, could foresee. All that was needed was the moment when apprentice would rise, exceeding even the vision of master, and at last spring the trap prepared for centuries. From this lineage would come Sidious, whose name would eclipse time itself. But still, before his arrival, the unseen centuries moved with quiet inevitability, each hidden Sith Lord conducting their own piece of the great orchestration, each hand riding the shadow behind the Republic's destiny. The grand plan, like the Sith themselves, did not roar into being but emerged across slow centuries, an edifice of intent refined carefully by each master and apprentice of the rule of two. Where once wars had been conducted with blades, fleets, and planetary bombardments visible to all, this new effort was quieter than silence, heavier than shadow. It was manipulation drawn into a vision so patient it spanned lifetimes, designed to erode the galaxy's order from within until collapse appeared not as conquest, but as political inevitability. To Sith eyes, at last, the great truth had been learned, that brute war might die in generations, but corruption could outlive centuries. The plan was not yet perfected in its earliest forms. Among the long chain of secret Sith masters, there were experiments, attempts, half-successes that revealed lessons later refined by their successors. Some infiltrated dynasties and walked among noble bloodlines, planting heirs who even centuries later unknowingly carried Sith ambition in their veins. Others bent economic guilds to their influence, corrupting trade fleets and market councils so thoroughly that galactic commerce itself could be tugged toward or away from prosperity according to Sith will. These experiments were rarely recognized as Sith deeds, for their authors wore disguises, assumed names, concealed their true nature. The galaxy saw only scandals, collapses, and strange turns of politics. Yet through every disruption, Sith tradition crept forward, gathering more ways to bend civilization into a future where its trust would be betrayed entirely. This doctrine of invisible empire reached its most chilling clarity in the teachings of Darth Plagueis, master of biological and cosmic manipulation, who studied not only politics but the very possibility of bending life and death itself. He is spoken of as physician and alchemist of the dark side, who imagined not merely an empire bounded by territory, but one that grasped after immortality itself. In him, the grand plan reached beyond politics. It reached toward permanence, a design that life itself might be bound to Sith dominion, unbreaking, unending. Plagueis taught his apprentice Sidious, a figure who would eclipse even the master's ambition. Sidious listened as his teacher unraveled centuries of Sith secrecy, explaining that the Republic would not be killed in a battle, but hollowed from its foundation upward. Its politics, already bloated, corrupt, and driven by self-interest, would be bent to serve Sith aims until the Republic itself would declare Sith dominion willingly, mistaking it for stability and order. Its guardians, the Jedi, would be distracted, politicized, exhausted in wars manufactured only to drain them of judgment and will. Only then, when their vigilance fell into blindness, would the Sith break cover at last, no longer in secrecy, but in supreme control. By the time of Sidious, the galaxy stood precisely where the grand plan required it. The Republic swelled outwardly as the largest civilization history had ever known, yet inside it was decadent, burdened by corruption and political paralysis. The Jedi sat in lofty chambers upon Coruscant, closely tied to the Chancellor's Senate, yet paradoxically weakened by it, burdened with responsibilities they could no longer fulfill. The Republic still believed in its ideals, but those ideals sagged under the weight of centuries. It was a tree hollowed by termites, still standing, still leafy, but brittle. For the Sith, it was perfection. Sidious observed it all with patience that seemed inexhaustible, yet he wore faces that hid his nature so thoroughly that none could suspect, presenting himself as dutiful servant of the Republic while in truth guiding its collapse strand by strand. The grand plan became art in his hands. Wars engineered to weaken Jedi resolve, factions cultivated and then set against each other, commerce guilds corrupted, the Senate gridlocked through intrigues he himself had orchestrated. From every crisis, he harvested opportunity, while his enemies mistook him for savior. It had taken the Sith millennia to learn this lesson, but in Sidious the cycle found culmination. For while Sado, Kuin, and Revan had burned with brilliance and been undone, Sidious was flame that nobody saw until everything was already ash. He did not walk with armies until the galaxy itself had invited him to lead them. He did not proclaim dominion until dominion was already fact. He did not strike at the Jedi until they had already been stripped of perception, their loyalty bound to a republic that was decaying under his orchestration. The war that erupted in this age, the Clone Wars, was no true war at all, but a theater directed by Sidious in perfection of Sith subtlety. Both sides, Republic and Separatist, moved armies supplied and commanded with Sith design. Jedi became generals, worn down by endless battles against soldiers engineered to exhaust them, while senators clung ever more desperately to the figure of Sidious, then Chancellor, who promised balance out of chaos. Again and again he staged crisis until the galaxy, weary, welcomed his control. The grand plan, therefore, was not merely conquest. It was corruption so thoroughly matured that conquest would not be recognized as such. The Republic fell, yet its fall was so disguised that countless citizens believed they entered a new age of order, not bondage. The Jedi were slaughtered not in an open temple war, but betrayed by the very soldiers they had commanded, a betrayal woven into the fabric of the war's design. And through it all, Sidious presented himself not as tyrant at first, but as deliverer, ensuring that those he enslaved celebrated his rise. Looking backward across Sith history, the inevitability appears carved in stone. Every failure, every ruin, every betrayal refined into lesson, every lesson passed down through rule of two, every successor inheriting distilled wisdom, until at last Sidious pulled the threads taut. The shadows that had endured across millennia emerged, not in fleeting brilliance, but in dominion that seemed unbreakable. The grand plan had come to fruition. The Sith were no longer thought extinct. They were no longer cults in the wilderness, or tomb-lit whispers, or fleeting emperors destroyed in one generation. They had ascended into hidden mastery so perfect that, when at last they stepped forward into visibility, they emerged already enthroned. This moment did not mark return, but culmination. The Republic had declared victory countless times through the millennia. Only now did the Sith, in silence, declare theirs. The culmination of the grand plan arrived with terrifying precision, yet it was not perceived as climax until its machinery had already delivered victory. Sidious, born from Darth Bane's lineage and tempered by Darth Plagueye's whispered doctrines, stepped into history not as warlord with banners, but as chancellor cloaked in humility. He embodied the final transformation of the Sith, from conquerors waging visible flame to rulers who persuaded the galaxy to light the fire itself. It had taken millennia to craft this level of patience and subtlety, but in Sidious, those centuries condensed into one figure whose orchestration transformed schemes into reality. The Clone Wars, so named by the galaxy unaware of the truer architect behind them, were themselves a net deliberately cast. On one side stood the Galactic Republic, its legions swollen with an army conjured seemingly by providence. The clones of Kamino, ordered under phantom contracts that no senator could trace. On the other hand rose the Confederacy of Independent Systems, an alliance of secessionists, merchants, and manufacturers led from behind curtains by Sidious's first apprentice, Count Dooku, Darth Tyrannus. Both sides were creations of the Sith, two halves of a false war conceived to grind the Republic into exhaustion while vesting ever more authority in its chancellor. The Jedi, exalted across centuries as guardians rather than generals, were thrust into command of legions. This was transition by necessity, or so they believed, for who else could lead the Republic in defense of its loyal worlds? Yet to lead those armies was to be transformed. Jedi became generals rather than arbiters, commanders of campaigns rather than detached seekers of peace. They surrendered themselves without recognition to the erosion Sidious required, to stretch their order across thousands of systems, to make them vulnerable, weakened, and exposed. Every strand of the war was woven to Sidious's advantage. Battles prolonged deliberately, victories allowed before defeat returned, distant systems contested endlessly with no lasting clarity. The Jedi sacrificed themselves in war after war, but no battlefield brought resolution, for resolution was never the purpose. This was no galactic conflict between factions. It was a single plan unfolding, the long strategy of the Sith, bleeding their enemies by their own loyalty until the moment came when the final knife could pierce. In those years, the galaxy did not recognize that it was already enslaved. As crises compounded, Sidious, as Supreme Chancellor, was granted more emergency powers. Without recognizing the duplicity, senators voted their own authority into his hands. Citizens celebrated him as savior, the only figure capable of guiding them through chaos. Each speech cloaked his dominion. Each gesture lined the future throne. By the time his control was absolute, formality was all that remained. For in truth, the galaxy had surrendered long before the Jedi fell. The final betrayal, executed as though inevitable, bore a name remembered endlessly thereafter: Order 66. Conceived years before the first battle, it lay inscribed into the very genetic programming of the clone legions. Each soldier had lived beside a Jedi commander, obeyed them, trusted them, even admired them. Yet in one instant, as Sidious pronounced the order, legions across every front turned their weapons against their leaders. Jedi fell not in duels of honor, but in sudden volleys of fire from those they had commanded. Entire generations of guardians were extinguished in a single synchrony, so swift and thorough that the order could not defend itself. The Great Jedi Purge was not undertaken by Sith armies, nor led by banners of Sith lords, but as an act of complete orchestration through shadows and deception. It was not power wielded openly that destroyed the Jedi. It was patience fulfilled, all threads of manipulation tightened into one lethal moment. By the time the assault upon their great temple on Coruscant was led by Sidious's new apprentice, Darth Vader, the Jedi Order was already a ruin. The temple's flames were symbolic only. Their fall had been written years before beneath the calm deliberations of the Senate and the laboratories of Kamino. For the Sith, this was a triumph beyond any prior dominion. No resurgence had ever so thoroughly annihilated their enemies. Exar Kun had been repelled. Revan had been betrayed. Malak had been undone. The resurgent empire of centuries past had collapsed under weight of faction. But now, the Jedi, once thought eternal guardians, were reduced to hunted fugitives scattered across a galaxy already pledging loyalty to their destroyer. The Republic, once claimant of resilience, had turned itself entirely into the galactic empire without realizing the transition. It was not conquest, it was transformation. Sidious revealed himself not as Chancellor, but as Emperor, declaring the Republic's end as though natural culmination rather than betrayal. The Senate applauded. Citizens rejoiced at the prospect of order and safety. They had not been conquered but lulled, fooled into surrendering their freedom willingly. And the Jedi, the only obstacle, lay dead beneath the weight of a single command. From the shadows, the Sith had risen not with fleets, but with inevitability. In this moment, centuries of secrecy resolved themselves into permanence. The Sith did not simply re-emerge, they ruled. Their banner became the imperial standard, their power written into law, their dominion enforced by legions who believed themselves loyal patriots. There was no war left to fight. The war had already been lost in the Senate's debates, in the clone vats of Kamino, in the complacency of guardians too entangled with politics to perceive their unraveling. The grand plan stood complete. The Jedi Purge resonates as the purest expression of what the Sith had become under the long shadow of Bane's decree. From master to apprentice, through centuries of secrecy, they had abandoned the futility of open war. They had refined themselves until they became like gravity, invisible, subtle, but irresistible. The Purge was not merely extermination, it was lesson. It confirmed that Sith endurance and patience could eclipse even the oldest and brightest guardians the galaxy had ever known. And so the Sith stood enthroned, not in caves or hidden temples, not in fleeting bursts of warlord empires, but above the galaxy entire. The Republic was gone, the Jedi broken, and Order 66 whispered the new truth, that the Sith had won at last, and even the stars themselves seemed to bow. The rise of the Galactic Empire marked not simply victory, but culmination. For thousands of years, Sith history had moved in cycles of ambition and collapse, flame and ruin, resurgence and betrayal. Every warlord, every empire, every cult had risen bright for a span of decades or centuries before falling to the weight of its own hunger. But with the proclamation of the Empire, the shadows had shifted course. Here was no fleeting conquest, no fractured dominion bleeding itself on the battlefield. Here was a state consecrated by law, celebrated by people, and cloaked in inevitability. It was not that the Sith had seized the galaxy anymore. It was that the galaxy had, step by step and without realizing, surrendered itself willingly to Sith dominion. From the vast halls of the once resplendent Senate to the star-flecked reaches of the Outer Rim, the banners of the Empire unfurled. At its apex stood Darth Sidious, Emperor, heir to Darth Bane's patient lineage, the single thread of Sith inheritance that had outlived every war, every exile, every ruin. He ruled not as conqueror shouting his creed from the tombs of Korriban, but as statesman cloaked in robes of governance, the galaxy receptive to his hand precisely because they had already been conditioned to trust him. His was the victory not of armies and sudden force alone, but of deception matured across centuries, of patience realized. Beneath him moved Darth Vader, apprentice and enforcer. Once Jedi Knight, now Dark Lord, Vader embodied both tragedy and inevitability. The apprentice who had enough will and passion to slay his brotherhood, but not yet the clarity to overthrow his master. He was emblem and weapon both, a reminder of Jedi defeat, and a warning to survivors who still wandered the stars burdened by memory of their order. He enforced the Emperor's will with merciless strength, extinguishing what remained of the Jedi so methodically that their continued existence became rumor rather than cause. In Vader, the galaxy saw the might of an apprentice perfected to serve, for the moment, beneath the patience of the master. The empire that rose under Sidious exemplified the philosophy that the Sith had distilled across their entire hidden millennium. Every element of its structure reflected both pragmatic control and deeper currents of Sith tradition. Fear was its chain, law bent into instrument rather than shield, order imposed not for justice but for obedience. The Senate, kept alive as hollow theater, served as mask, its debates quietly meaningless as the Emperor shaped will unilaterally. The military, swollen from Republic legions, became a machine directed not merely by strategy, but by constant vigilance against disloyalty. Officers rose and fell in webs of suspicion designed to keep them perpetually subordinate, mirroring the Sith dynamic of master and apprentice magnified across a galactic system. What the ancient Sith had sought in monuments of stone upon Korriban or Sidious, Sidious etched instead into structures of military and political dominance. The might of fleets, the building of superweapons, the concentration of fear through terror itself, all were temple and sacrament now. Sith sorcery persisted in secrets kept to Palpatine alone, but Empire itself became their ritual, the machinery of oppression their altar, the endless obedience of billions their offering. To the Jedi who survived in fragments, scattered into exile or hunted ceaselessly across forgotten worlds, this was nightmare flowering. The ideals of their order, unbroken for millennia, seemed annihilated in one generation. They who had guided the galaxy into peace through countless centuries now wandered as ghosts, hunted by a Sith Lord who ruled not hidden but unveiled, his apprentice striking with mechanical fury wherever resistance stirred. The Force itself seemed cloaked in shadow, bound to dominion that had perfected itself across thousands of years of patience. And yet, beneath this absolute triumph, the same familiar rhythm of Sith history whispered still. For though Sidious had risen supreme, though his grand plan had achieved its intent, he too had an apprentice standing beneath him. And the rule of two, though refined into perfection, held within itself inevitability. Eventually, apprentice must challenge master. Though Vader served, and though Sidious outmaneuvered him at every turn, the pattern inscribed by Bane's doctrine ensured that this balance could not endure unbroken. In the silence of dominance, the seeds of fracture were yet alive. But for the time, the galaxy lay beneath an order more complete than any Sith dominion had ever achieved. The Empire spread into every corridor, every system, embedding itself into the daily lives of citizens who had once sworn loyalty to a republic now vanished. Sith power had ceased to be rumor and had become the ruling law of the stars themselves. Here ended the long patience of concealment, and here began an era where the Sith no longer needed silence, because they had bent the galaxy itself into their silence. This was not a return to darkness as memory. This was the age where the galaxy itself became instrument, and the Sith stood enthroned at the center, their shadows stretching farther than even the tomb-bearing valleys of Korriban could have dreamed. The Galactic Empire, in form and presence, was the high watermark of Sith dominion across the ages. For millennia the Sith had risen and fallen, appearing in violent bursts only to collapse once more into their own betrayals and rivalries, scattered ashes that the Jedi believed forever extinguished. Sidious changed that cycle. The rule of two, carried unbroken from Darth Bane, had finally borne fruit in his reign. The Sith were no longer a whisper in the ruins of Korriban or phantoms bound to tombs. They governed the galaxy openly, exalted by multitudes who served their regime, many of them unknowing of the true ancient shadow enthroned above them. But beneath this grandeur and consolidation, familiar undercurrents stirred inevitably, for every Sith age, no matter how absolute, contained beneath it the echo of instability. Darth Vader's presence reflected this paradox, both the symbol of Sith victory and the embodiment of Sith division. As apprentice to Sidious, Vader enacted the will of the Empire without hesitation, extinguishing Jedi remnants, crushing dissent, and spreading fear wherever the fires of rebellion dared to stir. He was the shadow that loomed over every system, the enforcer who confirmed the finality of the Jedi's fall. And yet, by his very existence, he remained the reminder of succession to come. The rule of two was not a gentle pattern. It was the law of predation. At some point the apprentice must surpass, betray, and overthrow. That inevitability, veiled but uninterrupted, continued even within this perfected empire. The galaxy beneath Sith rule existed in a paradox of permanence and tension. For ordinary citizens, The Empire was law, order, and in many places even welcomed stability compared to the fracturing corruption of the Republic's last days. Star systems bled wealth into imperial coffers, fleets darkened the hyperlanes, and the central authority of Coruscant reached deeper than the Republic had ever managed. The endless debates of the Senate, once choked in indecision, transformed into directives from the Emperor's throne, decisions swift, uncompromising, rarely challenged. Yet for those who wished to remember freedom, or who still cherished the ideals of the Republic, this same efficiency was suffocation. The Jedi, once dispersed into the farthest reaches as trusted stewards, had been reduced to hunted phantoms. Some attempted to resist alone, only to be extinguished swiftly. Others concealed themselves in exile, waiting for some turn of fortune that might allow them to answer the shadow that now swallowed the galaxy. They were reduced to rumor, to whispers in villages of hermits once known as guardians, or to bedtime stories nursing a hope that hope itself had not entirely perished. Sidious and Vader ensured that the Order had no roots left, and each year the survivors became fewer, diminished to scattered embers nearly indistinguishable from myth. To Sidious, this was triumph refined, his patience and calculation made manifest. And yet it was not enough merely to rule. From the beginning of his clandestine career, Sidious had envisioned empire not as endpoint, but as foundation. His plans stretched into permanence, envisioning superweapons that could hold the entire galaxy in instant submission, the Death Star foremost among them. These projects embodied Sith philosophy itself, the accumulation of so much concentrated fear that rebellion would die before it could be imagined. Where Bane had built secrecy to ensure survival, Sidious envisioned architectures of annihilation to ensure dominion. Such devices were temples not of faith, but of terror, monuments no less than Corbin's tombs, designed to carry Sith will into eternity. But beneath the weight of triumph, beneath the terror of imperial strength, there always remained the ancient tendency of the Sith toward fracture. Sidious trusted no one, not even his apprentice. Vader, for his part, bore loyalty twisted by pain, but within him lingered the remnants of Anakin Skywalker, memories, attachments, fragments of self that the Emperor believed smothered, but which continued to breathe beneath armor and fire. Here lay the flaw inscribed within the rule of two since its origin. The apprentice inherits strength, yet inheritance ensures inevitable defiance. Sidious wielded Vader, but also prepared against him, forever seeking new possible apprentices, new instruments of succession should Vader fail or betray. The Empire itself mirrored this careful paranoia. Sidious cultivated rivalries in his military and political class, never allowing any general or governor power enough to rival his throne. Promises were extended, but trust withheld. Fear replaced loyalty as the only unifying force, ensuring submission but never granting stability deeper than obedience wrung through terror. In a strange way, the Empire functioned as an externalized Sith tradition, a galaxy ordered under the same dynamic by which Sith themselves operated. Master above all, servants competing beneath, each fearful, each seeking advantage, each aware betrayal lingered beneath every word. And yet, for the first time in Sith history, it appeared as though betrayal had been contained. The Jedi were nearly erased. The Senate, though still formally existing, had been rendered impotent. No fleets opposed Imperial control directly. For nearly 2 decades, Sidious and Vader sat enthroned in what seemed permanence. To citizens born within this age, it felt as though the Sith presence had always been sovereign, as though no other order had preceded it. For the Sith, it was culmination, the rule of two triumphant, the ancient patience fulfilled. But even in absolute rule, there murmured the inevitabilities of Sith flaw. Vader remained apprentice. Sidious remained threatened, even in omnipotence, by the specter of his own mandate, that the apprentice must always seek to overthrow the master. And faint sparks began to stir across the galaxy. Rebel cells forming in quiet corners, whispered gatherings across frontier systems. They were insignificant at first, beneath notice of an empire so vast. But even a spark, in time, can find fuel. The Sith had accomplished what none of their ancestors could endure. Their empire reached farther, stood longer, and bent deeper than any before. And yet, like all before it, the very nature of its foundation ensured it too carried fracture within its triumph. Beneath the grandeur of Sidious, beneath the armor of Vader, the eternal rhythm of Sith history waited. And it whispered the same truth as the tombs of Corbin long ago, that every victory smuggles the seed of its own ruin. For nearly 2 decades, the Sith empire of Sidious and Vader stood unrivaled, a dominion that seemed to dissolve all possibility of resistance. Its fleets spanned every system. Its governors commanded through fear. Its instruments of terror, planetary occupation, secret police, weapons of annihilation, ensured obedience so thorough that the majority of citizens learned to abide not because of loyalty, but because of resignation. In this climate, the Sith at last appeared unchallengeable, their triumph complete, their shadows stretching into every star. Yet, as with every Sith empire that had come before, cracks began as whispers at first, rising not from might equal to the Emperor, but from quiet places unconsidered. The Jedi remnants who had survived Order 66, scattered and haunted, remained as hunted prey. Some were extinguished early, betrayed by those they trusted, felled in remote villages, or betrayed for reward. Others retreated into deeper exile, hermits on desert planets, wanderers without name, shades moving only at the edge of the galaxy's sight. For a time they appeared absent, their order finished. But exile breeds memory, and in the stillness of memory lay the potential of return. In their anonymity, the ancient guardians waited, clinging not to institutions but to the Force itself, believing as they always had that renewal was possible even in darkest shadow. The true resistance, however, came not from Jedi but from the people themselves. The Rebel Alliance, fragile in beginning, emerged not as heir to Republic but as weary reaction to suffocation. First uprisings were brushed aside by the Empire as insignificant, an irritant handled by local garrisons. But sparks, if they persist, begin to gather. Regional insurrections began weaving together, connected by couriers, trusted leaders, and by the silent discontent of billions. Though the Empire dwarfed them in power, the rebels carried something the Sith misunderstood, the refusal of memory to be extinguished. Where Sith dominion sought obedience through terror, rebellion stitched together hope, however frail. Vader, as the Emperor's hand, was dispatched often to suppress these emergent cells with precision. Entire families were destroyed, whole townships burned, examples made brutal enough to silence. And yet repression did not destroy the idea. It only spread further resentment, sharpening the resolve of those who survived to fight another day. Sidious, immersed in his own grandeur, welcomed rebellion in part, confident it could be crushed at his leisure, and certain that a common enemy kept citizens tightly bound to his throne. As with all his calculations, cruelty doubled as strategy. The turning of this era came with a faint, almost negligible emergence, a child of Tatooine, hidden from sight, bearing a name that once belonged to the Jedi of older days. Luke Skywalker, unknown, seemingly ordinary, became the thread through which the Jedi Order, thought forever broken, breathed once more. His rise was nothing the Emperor had foreseen, yet it shaped itself directly out of the fractures within Sith tradition. For Vader, confronted with his son's existence, began at last to waver within the contradictions that Sidious believed long extinguished in him. Attachment, compassion, remnants of a life buried beneath armor and mask ignited again. Here resurfaced the eternal truth of the rule of two. For Vader's loyalty could never be absolute. The very structure of Sith succession demanded conflict. Sidious believed himself immune, confident his apprentice's hunger had been blunted into obedience. Yet in Luke's emergence, Vader saw not only his own past, but the echo of a future in which he might yet overthrow his master. The apprentice shifted inwardly toward betrayal, as every apprentice before him had, and Sidious, enshrined in arrogance, did not perceive the depth of this change until the moment it manifested. The Empire by then was constructing its great instrument of terror, the Death Star, embodiment of Sidious's vision of ultimate control. To annihilate whole worlds in a single instant was a promise of domination that not even the most rebellious system could deny. In his mind, such a weapon was the culmination not merely of power, but of philosophy, that fear could be wielded so comprehensively it became eternal. Yet, as has always been the case in Sith history, the pursuit of absolute power birthed absolute overreach. The rebels, scattered and fragile, yet guided by determination, struck precisely when arrogance blinded their enemy. From hidden bases and borrowed fleets, they delivered a blow the galaxy thought impossible, the destruction of the Death Star. This moment, though on the scales of war but one battle, signaled the unraveling of Sidious's certainty. For centuries he had manipulated, orchestrated, long before enemies even recognized they were trapped, and yet here an unforeseen victory cracked open the image of inevitability. Rebellion had burned the first true wound into his empire. The Sith still stood supreme, still commanded fleets and legions innumerable, but now his shadow was pierced by a faint light that no suppression could erase. Hope itself had survived, and hope armed itself with memory of victory. As the rebellion grew, feeding upon its triumph, the insidious weakness in the Sith bond between master and apprentice deepened. Vader, now obsessed with Luke's survival and conversion, began to see in his son the possibility of renewed succession. He sought to draw Luke not to destroy him, but to replace Sidious with father and son reigning together. This desire was ambition clothed in bloodline, but it was ambition all the same, the precise ambition Bane enshrined as both essence and flaw of Sith continuity. Sidious sensed it, but too late, for his own arrogance in believing he had perfected every design left him open in ways none of his predecessors had dared. When the final confrontation came aboard the second Death Star, the ancient rhythm of Sith betrayal played its last, inevitable measure. Sidious, demanding Luke kill his father to take his place, fashioned the same trap played across generations. Master testing apprentice, cultivating succession through blood. But this time, the chain fractured in an unforeseen way. Luke refused both paths. He would not kill his father, nor kneel before Sidious. In that refusal, Vader remembered at last what fragments of Anakin Skywalker had never died, and turned not against his son, but against his master. Sidious, undone not by Jedi armies but by the truth of his own design, perished in betrayal, as all Sith masters before him had. Thus ended the greatest triumph the Sith had ever known, not in the conquest's endurance, but in the persistence of the same law that had followed them since exile. Ambition devours itself, and betrayal ensures the cycle never ceases. The Empire collapsed not in grand fleets destroyed in frontal war, but with master thrown down by apprentice, in the truest, sharpest rhythm of their creed. The galaxy awakened from under centuries of shadow, the Sith lineage appearing broken at last. The Jedi survived only as ember and whisper, but ember enough to spread. The rule of two, perfected in patience, culminated at Palpatine's hand, only to yield once again to its own inevitability. And so, as the stars turned back toward freedom, Sith history repeated its endless refrain, that in triumph lies ruin, and in secrecy lies return. For even in death, even in betrayal, the Sith were never truly gone. The death of Sidious upon the unfinished Death Star was for many across the galaxy a moment that seemed to sever the ancient current of Sith history. The Emperor, whose shadow had stretched across every star and whose will had bound entire worlds into silence, was hurled into the abyss by the hand of his own apprentice. Darth Vader, once hunter of the Jedi, scourge of rebellion, and terror of countless systems, was at the end of his path redeemed only by the defiance of his son and the refusal to perpetuate the same cycle of betrayal that had defined millennia of Sith tradition. In that instant, the rule of two cracked upon itself, destroyed not by violence from without, but by compassion from within. The galaxy trembled with the sudden void of Sith dominion. The Empire, vast in fleet and system, staggered without its master. The Senate had been dismissed, the lines of governance had long since hollowed, and like a war machine with its heart torn out, the remaining structure collapsed into inertia and infighting. Admirals and governors attempted to seize authority in the void, but all authority had flowed through Sidious. Without him, there was no center, and without a center, the greatest edifice Sith had ever built dissolved like dust caught in sudden wind. The Jedi, thought extinguished utterly in the Purge, re-emerged if not in number, then in symbol. Luke Skywalker, last descendant of that ancient line, stood now as inheritor of their tradition, one among billions, yet enough to turn memory into presence again. His survival assured that the Jedi were not myth, but still truth, and in that truth lay new promise. For the galaxy, this return was small in number, but vast in meaning. The Guardians who had guided peace across millennia were not utterly gone. For the Sith, however, this collapse repeated the same rhythm written since their beginnings in exile. Sidious, heir to Bane, architect of centuries, master of the grand plan, had triumphed as none before him ever had. And yet, like all Sith masters, he fell to betrayal from within. Vader, though shackled to Sidious for decades, turned in the final instant. The rule of two, the law that had refined Sith secrecy into endurance, proved unbreakable, but still fatally cyclical. Every apprentice born to hunger, every master urging succession, each bond finally collapsing into violence. Thus, even their greatest culmination proved no different, master undone by apprentice, in blood, as had been since antiquity. The Empire's fall did not mean the Sith were gone. In the murk of legends told afterward, whispers persist of Sidious enduring beyond death, of contingency plans etched deeper even than his grand plan, of cloned vessels or fragmented spirits grasping across eternity. Sith history never ceases, for its current is less a straight line than a spiral, curling back upon itself again and again. Even in apparent extinction, the creed finds vessel. Holocrons still whisper on Corbin, archives remain buried in Ziast, artifacts pass through hands that do not understand their full danger. Sith knowledge has never been fully erased, only hidden, waiting for those desperate or ambitious enough to seek it. Many in the galaxy believe that with Sidious's death the Sith were ended. The Jedi, few though they were, allowed such hope to outwardly flourish. But beneath that hope, anyone who has studied the endless pattern knows otherwise. Even in downfall, the Sith endure. Even in ruin, they are preserved. For their strength is not seated only in empires nor in names, but in the inexhaustible human truth of hunger, that some will always seek dominion, some will always rebel against restraint, some will always turn to shadow. And because of this truth, the Sith can never be entirely severed. Thus, the lineage described across these 17 chambers of history closes not with finality, but with echo. The Sith have risen from exile, from ruin, from tombs, from cults. They have ruled as emperors, betrayed as apprentices, perished in flame, and whispered from beyond death. Their story is less one of empire than of inevitability. Again and again, across thousands of years, the same cycle turns. Ambition rising, empire swelling, betrayal splitting, ruin descending, shadow enduring. And so long as the galaxy endures, it seems destined to turn again. The end of Sidious and Vader brought about the dissolution of their dominion, the empire splintering, the rebellion ascending into new governance. The Jedi returned to presence, if not yet to strength. But one truth remains unchanged, etched deeper than tomb, darker than exile, older than monument. The Sith are eternal not because they endure as rulers always, but because their shadow reappears wherever hunger for power, secrecy, and domination waits. To name them dead is always to speak a lie. To name them ended is always to misunderstand. This, then, is the conclusion written not in certainty, but in warning, that the Sith are never truly gone. Their history flows like an undercurrent hidden beneath the waves of galactic time, at moments still and invisible, at later moments crashing to destroy everything that lives above. The Empire has fallen. Sidious and Vader lie broken. Yet the rhythm remains, waiting for the next seeker, the next apprentice, the next master, the next inevitable chapter of shadow to begin again. And now the litany grows thin, the echo spent, the pages near their end. The Sith, spoken through exile and blood, through empire and ruin, pass back into silence once more. In the dimness of these halls, one feels not triumph nor defeat, but the stillness of dust upon ancient carvings. The names have been pronounced, the cycles unveiled, and yet nothing has been altered. The history returns to sleep. Among ruined temples the air lies heavy, sand flowing in slow rivers among half-buried monoliths. Once these stones heard chanting, once they burned with torches unquenched for centuries. Now they rest beneath starlight, crumbling, forgotten, save for wind that whispers along their edges. The galaxy above moves on with new stories, yet down here, sealed by time, shadow lingers, content to wait as it always has. Artifacts lie locked in forgotten sanctums, their surfaces cooled of touch, their secrets nestled deep within crystal and iron. No hand disturbs them, no eye sees them, and yet one knows that the silence is not final, for each relic waits for the day someone opens it, hearing again the old whisper that power is eternal. Night falls, though there is no dawn nor dusk in the hollows of space, only the slow turning of stars. They glimmer indifferently, cold witnesses to empires rising and dissolving. Their light brushes the dust on Korriban, the broken spires of Zyast, the jungle-buried sanctuaries of Yavin, touching all with the same indifferent radiance. Here our recitation ends, and the voice diminishes into the same dust it has stirred. All that remains is silence, ruin, faint trace of footsteps and sand, the still air of tombs waiting through millennia. Memory recoils into darkness, and the echo dissolves. The story is gone. The shadow lingers. Silence is complete.